I watched it burn. God help me, I watched the parchment curl and blacken in the flames, the ancient ink bubbling like blood, and as it burned, the words began to scream. Not metaphorically. They screamed with human voices, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all shrieking in languages I'd never heard but somehow understood. And then the shadow moved. It peeled itself off the wall like wet leather, and I saw its face, or what should have been a face. Instead there were just eyes. Thousands of eyes, blinking in sequence, each one reflecting my own terrified expression back at me. That's when I knew the abbey had never been abandoned. The monks hadn't left. They were still there. They'd always been there. Just not in any form that the living should ever witness. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when I still thought shadows were just absence of light. Hey there, everyone. Before I take you down this road with me, I need you to do something. If this story grabs you, if you feel that cold finger tracing down your spine, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Is it 3 in the morning? Are you alone in your room with the lights off? Tell me. Because I need to know someone else knows what happened at Thornwick Abbey. I need witnesses to my testimony. Now, let's begin. And I'm warning you, once you hear this, you won't forget it. Some stories stick to you like oil, and this is one of them. My name is Henry Blackwood, and in the autumn of 1899, I was a 26-year-old antiquarian in the employ of the Berkshire Historical Society in Massachusetts. Fresh out of Harvard with degrees in theology and ancient languages, I was eager, ambitious, and possessed by that particular arrogance of youth that mistakes education for wisdom. I thought I understood the world through books and theory. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It was late October when I received the telegram that would change my life forever. The message was brief, sent by a wealthy industrialist named Cornelius Ashford, a man known for his eccentric collections and stranger obsessions. It read, Ancient Monastery Discovered. New York State. Documents require expert translation. Payment generous. Discretion essential. Reply immediately. The promise of generous payment alone would have been enough. I was barely scraping by on my society stipend, but it was that word, discretion, that truly hooked me. What kind of documents required secrecy? My imagination conjured visions of lost gospels, heretical texts, perhaps even pre-Columbian Christian artifacts that would rewrite history. I sent my acceptance within the hour. 2 days later, I found myself on a northbound train cutting through the October landscape of upstate New York. Ashford had been frustratingly vague in his follow-up correspondence, providing only an address in a small town called Ravensbrook, which I could find on no map. The train conductor claimed to have never heard of it, though he assured me there were dozens of small settlements in those mountains that barely warranted names. I disembarked at a station called Miller's Crossing as instructed, where a private coach awaited me. The driver was a hunched man with a face like weathered stone, who introduced himself only as Pike, and said nothing else for the entire 3-hour journey into the mountain. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than a rutted path that wound through dense forest of oak and pine, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday, we traveled in perpetual twilight. The forest itself felt wrong. I'm educated enough to dismiss superstition, but there's no other way to describe it. The trees grew at odd angles, their trunks twisted as if they'd been trying to grow away from something. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered. The only sound was the crunch of our wheels and the labored breathing of the horses, who seemed as reluctant to continue as I was beginning to feel. We emerged from the forest as the sun was setting, and there it was, Thornwick Abbey, perched on a rocky promontory overlooking a valley that was already filling with evening mist. The structure was medieval in style, clearly not built by colonial Americans but transported stone by stone from Europe, a practice not uncommon among the extremely wealthy. 3 stories of gray stone with a bell tower that reached toward the darkening sky like an accusing finger. Gothic windows, now empty of glass, stared out like dead eyes. The entire structure was covered in creeping ivy that had turned blood red in the autumn cold. But what struck me most was the silence. No wind stirred the ivy. No insects chirped in the gathering dusk. It was as if the abbey existed in a bubble of absolute quiet, a pocket of dead air where sound went to die. Pike pulled the coach to a stop before the main entrance and finally spoke, his voice like gravel grinding. I'll wait here till dawn. Not a minute longer. If you're not out by first light, I leave without you. Surely you're joking, I said, attempting a laugh that died in my throat. I'll need at least several days to dawn, Pike interrupted, his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to even look at the abbey. Mr. Ashford knows. He always knows how long a man can last in there. Before I could question this cryptic statement, the Abbey's front door swung open, and a figure emerged. Cornelius Ashford was not what I expected. Instead of an elderly eccentric, I found myself facing a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a suit that must have cost more than I earned in a year. Tall, with silver-streaked hair and eyes of such pale blue they appeared almost white in the dying light. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice cultured and warm, completely at odds with the oppressive atmosphere. "Punctual. I appreciate that. Please, come in. We have much to discuss and limited time." I gathered my bags, mostly notebooks, reference texts, and recording equipment, and approached the Abbey. As I crossed the threshold, I felt it, a pressure change, like ascending rapidly in altitude, making my ears pop. The temperature dropped at least 20 degrees. And there was a smell, faint but pervasive, burned parchment and something else, something organic and unpleasant. Ashford led me through a grand entrance hall lit by dozens of candles. The walls were bare stone, but I could see the faded outlines where tapestries had once hung. Our footsteps echoed with an odd resonance, as if the Abbey were far larger than its exterior suggested. "I should explain," Ashford began as we walked, "that Thornwick Abbey has a rather unusual history. It was built in 1347 by a splinter sect of Benedictine monks who fled persecution in France. They called themselves the Order of the Ascending Shadow, a name that should have warned anyone with sense to stay away. But they were brilliant scholars, you see. They claimed to have discovered texts that predated Christianity itself, knowledge that revealed the true nature of God and the cosmos. We ascended a spiral staircase, the steps worn smooth by centuries of feet. The order thrived for nearly 200 years, Ashford continued. They produced remarkable illuminated manuscripts, philosophical treatises, mathematical proofs that were centuries ahead of their time. But in 1547, something happened. The records are unclear, deliberately obscured, I suspect. What we know is that one night, the Abbey fell silent. When local villagers finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found the monastery completely abandoned. No bodies. No signs of struggle. Just empty rooms and a library full of books. "And the monks?" I asked. Ashford smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Never found. Some said they achieved their goal, ascension to a higher plane of existence. Others claimed they opened a door that should have remained closed. The Abbey was sealed, forgotten, lost to time. Until I found it 3 months ago while surveying land for a railroad expansion. We reached the 3rd floor, and Ashford pushed open a heavy oak door, revealing what had once been the Abbey's scriptorium. Long wooden desks lined the room, many still holding ancient quills and dried ink pots. But it was the walls that captured my attention. Every inch was covered in writing. Thousands upon thousands of words in dozens of languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and others I couldn't immediately identify. They seemed to flow across the stone like rivers of ink, converging and diverging, forming patterns that hurt to look at too long. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, and on that pedestal lay what I had been summoned to examine, a parchment, roughly 2 feet square, its edges burned black as if it had been partially consumed by fire but miraculously preserved. "The burned parchment," Ashford said softly, almost reverently. "I found it in the crypt below the Abbey, sealed in a lead box inscribed with warnings in 7 languages, all saying the same thing: let the forbidden remain risen. Let the shadow stay descended. Let this truth die unspoken." I approached the pedestal, my heart racing with scholarly excitement that overrode my growing unease. The parchment was covered in text written in a spiral pattern, starting from the center and radiating outward. The ink, if it was ink, had a peculiar quality, seeming to shimmer and shift in the candlelight. And there was something else. The parchment was warm to the touch. Not just room temperature, but actively warm, like living skin. "What do you need from me?" I asked, unable to tear my eyes from the text. "Translation," Ashford said simply. "I've brought in 3 other scholars before you. The first fled after 2 hours, claiming the text was cursed. The second lasted a full day before he began speaking in tongues and had to be restrained. The third..." Ashford paused. "The third managed to translate the first few lines before he gouged out his own eyes with a quill pen, screaming that he could see them watching him from behind the words. I should have left right then. Any sane man would have. But I was young, arrogant, and convinced that my superior education made me immune to whatever superstitious hysteria had claimed the others. I told myself that the text likely contained descriptions of heretical practices that had driven religiously minded scholars to madness, but that I, with my rational mind, would be unaffected. "I'll need proper lighting and my reference materials," I said, trying to sound professional despite the tremor in my voice. "And I'll want documentation of what the previous scholars translated before their incidents." Ashford smiled, clearly pleased. "Of course. I've prepared a workspace for you right here. Everything you need has been brought up. I'll leave you to begin. I'll be in the main hall if you need anything. But Mr. Blackwood," he paused at the door, "don't read the text aloud. Whatever you do, don't speak the words. That's when things tend to go very badly." He left me alone with the parchment and my instruments. I spent the next hour setting up, arranging lamps around the pedestal, laying out my lexicons and comparative linguistic texts, preparing fresh notebooks to record my findings. The entire time, I felt watched. Not the vague paranoia of being in an unfamiliar place, but the specific, intense sensation of eyes on the back of my neck. Several times I spun around, certain someone was standing behind me. But the room remained empty except for the shadows cast by the lamps, shadows that seemed perhaps a bit too dark, a bit too long for the light that created them. Finally, I sat before the parchment and began to read. The text was in ancient Greek, though written in a dialect I'd never encountered. But as I focused on the words, something strange happened. The meaning began to flow directly into my mind, bypassing the normal process of translation. It was as if the text was reading me rather than the other way around. The opening lines were deceptively simple. "We who sought the face of God have found instead the face behind the face. We who climbed toward heaven have discovered that heaven is merely the ceiling of a much deeper cellar. We are the forbidden, and we have risen. We are the shadow, and we haunt." I wrote these lines in my notebook, my hand steady despite the chill that was spreading through my body. The text continued, describing the Order's quest for divine knowledge, their studies of pre-Christian mystery cults, their experiments with meditation and sensory deprivation. They had been trying to achieve what they called the sacred ascension, a state of consciousness that would allow them to perceive higher dimensions of reality. And according to the parchment, they had succeeded. But what they found was not God or heaven or enlightenment. Instead, they discovered what the text called the underneath, a realm that existed in the spaces between spaces, in the gaps between moments, in the darkness behind closed eyelids. And in the underneath, things lived. Things that had been there long before humanity evolved the capacity for consciousness, things that saw our awareness as light sees a crack under a door, an opportunity for entry. The monks had opened themselves to the underneath, and the underneath had poured in. They had sought to rise but instead had sunk. They had become shadows, not metaphorical shadows, but literal ones. They existed now only as two-dimensional projections of their former selves, trapped between the world of light and the realm of underneath, unable to fully exist in either. And the worst part, according to the text, was that they were still conscious, still aware, still suffering in a state that was neither life nor death but something infinitely worse. They had become the forbidden risen, beings who had violated the fundamental separation between dimensions and paid for it with their very substance. I had been translating for perhaps 2 hours when I noticed that the shadows in the room were moving. Not the gradual shifting of shadows as lamp flames flickered, but deliberate, purposeful movement. A shadow cast by a desk was slowly crawling up the wall, despite the desk remaining perfectly still. Another shadow was stretching across the floor toward me, extending like a dark hand reaching from the corner of the room. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The sound echoed strangely, taking too long to fade, as if the room were much larger than it appeared. I grabbed one of the lamps and held it up, flooding the corners with light. The shadows recoiled, but they didn't disappear as shadows should. Instead, they pulled back to the edges of the light, pooling there, waiting. That's when I heard the sound. A whisper, so faint I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. It was coming from the parchment itself. I leaned closer, and yes, there was definitely sound emanating from the burned edges, a voice or multiple voices speaking in a language that made my head ache to hear. And within that incomprehensible whisper, I caught fragments of English. "See us now, he reads our truth, another one comes to witness, another one to add." I should have stopped then, should have grabbed my belongings and run from that place. But the translator's curse is curiosity, and I had to know what the rest of the parchment said. I convinced myself that the moving shadows were just tricks of the light, that the whispers were just the wind through the empty windows, that my unease was just the natural response to working in an abandoned building at night. I returned to the parchment and continued reading. The text became more disturbing as it progressed. It described the final days of the Order, how one by one the monks had begun to lose their shadows. They would wake to find their shadow missing, only for it to reappear hours later, but wrong somehow, facing the wrong direction, moving independently, or cast when no light source was present. Then the monks themselves began to flatten. They would be standing normally one moment, and the next they'd be pressed against the wall, two-dimensional, unable to move forward into the room but still able to see, still able to scream soundlessly. Some tried to flee, but they found they could only move along surfaces now, walls, floors, ceilings, sliding across them like dark stains. The last entry in the parchment was written by the abbot, a man named Cyrus Thornwick, for whom the abbey was later named. He described how he was the last one with dimension remaining, how he could see his brothers in faith watching him from the walls, their flat forms arranged around him like a grotesque audience. He wrote that he was burning the main book of their research, the Codex of the Underneath, hoping to seal away the knowledge that had doomed them. But he made one mistake. He kept this final testament, this burned parchment, as a warning. He wrote, "Let this be known to any who find this place, the Underneath is patient. It does not forget. We opened a door with our consciousness, and that door remains open through these words. Any who read this text with understanding give the Underneath a window into their mind. And through that window, the shadows can reach." The parchment ended there, mid-sentence, as if Abbot Thornwick had been interrupted. And at the very bottom, written in what looked disturbingly like burned flesh rather than burned parchment, was a single line in English that shouldn't have been possible, since the monks had vanished 50 years before English came to dominate America. "He is reading now. He will join us soon." I jerked back from the parchment as if burned. My lamp flickered and nearly went out. In that moment of dimness, I saw them. On every wall, hundreds of them. Flat, shadow-like figures of monks in robes, all facing toward me, all perfectly still. When the lamp brightened again, they were gone, or were they? The shadows on the walls seemed somehow thicker, somehow more present than ordinary shadows should be. I grabbed my notebook, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it, and fled toward the door. But when I reached for the handle, I noticed something that froze me in place. I had no shadow. The lamp was behind me, light streaming past my body, but the floor ahead of me was shadowless. I turned slowly, raising the lamp to cast light on the wall behind me. My shadow was there, but it wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood perfectly still, facing me, its arm raised in a wave. A greeting, or a mockery. Then it peeled off the wall. I can't describe the physics of what I saw. It shouldn't be possible for something two-dimensional to move into three-dimensional space, but it did. It inflated like a dark balloon, taking on depth and substance, until standing before me was a perfect shadow copy of myself, except its features were slightly wrong, slightly exaggerated, like a caricature drawn by someone who hated their subject. "You read the words," it said, and its voice was my voice but flattened, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "You understood the truth. Now you've given us form. Now we can reach." I hurled the lamp at it. The glass shattered against its form, oil and flame spreading across its surface. But instead of burning, the shadow drank in the fire, grew darker and more solid. It laughed, and the sound was wrong on a fundamental level. Laughter should have resonance, should have life in it. This was laughter recorded, then played backward, then forward again. I ran down the spiral staircase, taking steps 3 at a time, nearly falling a dozen times. Behind me, I heard footsteps, too many footsteps. The shadow wasn't alone. The entire order was following, pulled from the walls by my comprehension of their text, given form by my acknowledgement of their existence. I burst into the main hall where I'd left Ashford, but it was empty. The candles had all gone out. The only light came from the dying fire in the massive hearth. I rushed to it, grabbing a burning log like a weapon, holding it before me as I backed toward the main entrance. They emerged from every doorway, every shadow cast by every piece of furniture. Dozens of them, hundreds. The entire order of the ascending shadow, now the forbidden risen, all wearing those same robes, all with those same wrong features, like people remembered incorrectly, sketched from fading memory. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices creating a chorus that was somehow quieter than a whisper but louder than a scream. "You've read the text. You understand the truth. You've opened your consciousness to the underneath. You've already begun to flatten. Soon you'll slide across surfaces like us. Soon you'll haunt the spaces between spaces. Soon you'll be forbidden and risen." I looked down at my hand holding the burning log and screamed. It was flatter than it should be, like looking at a photograph of a hand rather than an actual hand. The shadows were right. I was already changing, already losing dimension, already becoming one of them. But then I heard it, a rooster crowing. Dawn. Pike had said he'd wait until dawn, and he was a man of his word. The sound of that rooster, that symbol of daylight and the normal world, cut through my terror like a blade. I bolted for the main entrance, dropping the burning log as I ran. The shadows surged after me, but as I threw open the door, sunlight streamed in. The shadows recoiled, writhing like living things in pain. Direct sunlight, they couldn't exist in it, couldn't maintain their semi-corporeal forms. They fled back into the deeper darkness of the abbey, hissing and whispering threats and promises. Pike was already turning the coach around, the horses wild-eyed and foaming. I threw myself into the coach without a word, and Pike whipped the horses into an immediate gallop, not even waiting for me to properly board. I clung to the door as we crashed back down the mountain path, branches tearing at the coach, until finally we burst out of that cursed forest into proper morning light. We didn't speak during the journey back to Miller's Crossing. What could I say? What would he believe? When we arrived, Pike finally turned to look at me, his stone face showing the first emotion I'd seen, pity. You read it, didn't you? The Parchment. They all read it eventually, despite the warnings. That's why Mr. Ashford keeps bringing new scholars. He's trying to translate the whole thing, piece by piece, using different people so no single person carries the complete curse. Where is Ashford? I demanded. He left me there. He abandoned me. Pike shook his head. Mr. Ashford never goes in. He sends others. He's been trying for 10 years to unlock the secrets in that place. 3 dozen scholars before you. Most flee. Some go mad. A few. He paused. A few never come out at all. We find them weeks later, pressed flat against the walls like paintings. But still moving. Still watching. I stumbled onto the train platform, my mind reeling. I looked down at my hands in the bright morning light. They appeared normal, three-dimensional, solid. But I knew the truth. I'd felt myself flattening. The process had begun. The question was whether it would continue now that I was away from the Abbey, or if the transformation was permanent, just progressing too slowly to notice day by day. That was 23 years ago. I'm 49 now, and I've spent every day since watching for signs, monitoring my reflection, measuring my body's shadow, checking to ensure my form maintains proper depth and dimension. Most days I seem normal, but there are moments, always in dim light, always when I'm alone, when I feel it. That flatness creeping up my spine, that sense of losing solidity, of becoming less than three-dimensional. And the shadows. God, the shadows. I see them everywhere now. In every darkened corner, every unlit hallway, every patch of darkness cast by furniture or buildings. I see figures. Watching. Waiting. The order of the ascending shadow, the forbidden risen, still trapped between worlds, still suffering their eternal punishment for seeking knowledge that should have remained hidden. They're always there, just out of direct light, and they're always watching me. Because I'm one of them now. Not fully, not yet. But inevitably. The text entered my consciousness, and consciousness can't be unlearned. I carry the knowledge of the underneath within me, and that knowledge is a doorway that can never be fully closed. Sometimes I wake at night and find myself standing against the wall, perfectly flat, unable to move forward. The first few times, I panicked, clawing at the wall, trying to peel myself off like a poster. But after 23 years, I've learned to wait. By morning, dimension returns, and I can step away from the wall as if nothing happened. But each time, it takes a little longer to regain full solidity. Each time, I feel the underneath pulling a little harder. I've tried to warn others. I've written to historical societies, religious organizations, anyone who might investigate or seal the Abbey. But my letters are ignored or dismissed as the ravings of a lunatic. I even tried to return once, with a group of priests who specialized in blessings and exorcisms. But when we reached the forest, the path was gone. The Abbey had hidden itself, or perhaps moved to another location. The underneath isn't bound by geography any more than shadows are bound to the objects that cast them. I've examined every religious text, every occult grimoire, every philosophical treatise on consciousness and reality. I'm searching for a way to close the door I opened when I read that cursed parchment. But the more I learn, the more I understand that there is no closing it. Consciousness can't unknow. Eyes that have seen can't unsee. I looked into the underneath, and the underneath looked back, and now we're forever connected. The abbot was right in his final warning. The underneath is patient. It doesn't need to consume me all at once. It can take me slowly, degree by degree, dimension by dimension, over years or decades or centuries? What's time to beings that exist outside of temporal sequence? What's waiting to entities that haunt the spaces between moments? I've left detailed instructions for after my death. My body is to be cremated immediately, no lying in state, no funeral viewing, no period where my corpse could be left in a dark room. Because I fear what might happen if my body were left in shadow after death. Would I rise? Would I peel myself off whatever surface holds my remains and join the others, fully forbidden, fully risen, another shadow monk haunting the walls of Thornwick Abbey? But even cremation might not be enough. Shadows aren't bound to physical form. They're projections of the object, not the object itself. Destroy the body, and the shadow might remain, might even be liberated to move more freely without the anchor of flesh to restrict it. I live now in a top-floor apartment with windows on all sides, keeping every lamp lit from dusk to dawn. I never enter a dark room. I never let my shadow fall on a wall unseen. I sleep, when I sleep, with lights blazing around me, because I know what's waiting in the darkness behind my eyelids. The underneath is always there, just on the other side of consciousness, and every time I close my eyes, I risk sinking into it. Last week, something new happened. I was walking down the street at noon, the sun directly overhead, and I noticed something strange. My shadow on the pavement was facing the wrong direction. My body was walking north, but my shadow was oriented south, as if it were walking away from me. A woman passed me, glanced down, and quickened her pace, her face pale. She saw it too. Others can see it now. The separation between my body and my shadow is becoming visible to the waking world. It's accelerating. The transformation I've held off for over 2 decades is finally completing. I can feel it in my bones, or rather, in the increasing flatness of my bones, as if they're being compressed into 2 dimensions one layer at a time. Soon I won't be able to maintain 3-dimensional form even in bright light. Soon I'll be like the others, sliding across surfaces, trapped in the in-between, neither alive nor dead but something that shouldn't exist at all. And the worst part, the truly horrifying part that keeps me writing this testimony instead of ending things while I still can, is that I don't entirely want to stop it. Because as I flatten, as I lose dimension and substance, I can see more. The underneath is becoming visible to me in ways it wasn't before. I can perceive the thin places where reality wears through, where other things are pressing against our world, trying to get in or out. Last night, I saw through a wall. Not around it, not over it, through it. I saw into my neighbor's apartment, saw her sleeping in her bed, saw her shadow peeling off the wall and standing over her, watching with malevolent intent. And I realized, everyone has a shadow. Everyone casts darkness. And in that darkness, things from the underneath can hide, can watch, can wait for their opportunity to reach through. The order of the ascending shadow weren't evil. They were just curious. They sought knowledge and found it. But knowledge has consequences, especially knowledge about the fundamental structure of reality. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some truths, once learned, can never be forgotten. I'm writing this as a warning, yes, but also as a confession. Because I'm going back. I've finally located Thornwick Abbey again, or perhaps it's located me, drawn by our connection. It appears now on my maps. Clear as day, as if it had always been there. I can see it when I close my eyes. The gray stone, the empty windows, the scriptorium with the burned parchment still resting on its pedestal, waiting. I'm going back because I need to finish the translation. The text I read covered only the first third of the parchment. There's more written there, spiraling inward to a center I never reached. And I need to know what's at that center. What final secret the abbot recorded before he flattened and joined his brothers in eternal shadow. Is this compulsion my own, or is it the underneath pulling me back? I can't tell anymore. The line between my will and the influence of that other realm has blurred beyond recognition. Maybe there never was a line. Maybe the moment I read those first words, I stopped being entirely myself and became partially something else. A hybrid. A door. A window between worlds. Tomorrow, I leave for Thornwick. I've arranged for this testimony to be published posthumously, or perhaps post-transformation would be more accurate. If you're reading this, it means I either never returned, or what returned wasn't human enough to prevent its publication. To anyone who seeks the Abbey, who thinks they can succeed where I failed, who believes their intellect or faith or courage will protect them, don't. The knowledge isn't worth the price. The secrets aren't worth the transformation. The Order of the Ascending Shadow learned this lesson 4 centuries ago, and they're still paying for it. Don't add yourself to their number. But if you must go, if curiosity or greed or destiny drives you to that gray stone building in the New York mountains, remember this: don't read the parchment aloud. Don't try to translate the entire text at once. And for God's sake, don't look at your shadow afterward, because if you do, you might notice that it's looking back. And once you see that, once you acknowledge that your shadow has awareness independent from your own, the door opens. The underneath notices. And your transformation begins. I can feel it now, as I write these final words. My hand is flattening against the page. The pen is becoming harder to grip as my fingers lose dimension. Soon I'll be unable to write, unable to speak, unable to exist in any way that matters to the living world. I'll be forbidden and risen, haunting the walls of Thornwick Abbey with all the others, trapped between dimensions, eternally conscious of our suffering but unable to express it except through shadows and whispers and the occasional terror we inflict on visitors curious enough to seek us out. Is that movement I see on my wall? Yes. They're gathering. The shadows are collecting, drawn by my approaching transformation. They know I'm ready. They know I'm coming home. One final warning, and then I must go. If you ever visit an old building and see shadows that don't match the objects casting them, leave immediately. If you ever hear whispers in languages you don't know but somehow understand, seal your ears and run. And if you ever find a burned parchment promising forbidden knowledge, do what the monks should have done. Burn it completely. Scatter the ashes. Salt the earth. Because some texts don't contain knowledge, they contain doorways. And the things waiting on the other side are very, very patient. They're here now. In my room. Peeling off the walls despite the light. My lamp is guttering. The sun outside my window is setting impossibly fast, or perhaps time is simply different now that I'm mostly underneath rather than above. They're reaching for me with their flat, shadow hands. And I'm reaching back. Because I understand now. The order didn't fail. They succeeded. They ascended, just not in the way they expected. They found a higher state of consciousness. It just happened to exist in a lower dimension. They're more aware now than they ever were in life, perceiving things we can't see, experiencing reality in ways we can't comprehend. And soon, I'll join them. Soon I'll be forbidden and risen. Soon I'll haunt the Abbey, another shadow among shadows, another warning unheeded, another price paid for curiosity. The last thing I see with my three-dimensional eyes is my reflection in the darkening window. I'm already more shadow than man. My features are blurring. My substance is draining away. And behind me, I can see them all, the entire order, hundreds of shadow monks, welcoming their newest brother. The last thing I feel is the wall pressing against my back, or perhaps me pressing into the wall, as my body loses its final dimension and becomes one with the darkness. The last thing I think is, at least I'll finally know what's written at the center of the parchment. At least I'll finally understand the ultimate secret. And then I'm not thinking anymore. Not in any way that the living would recognize as thought. I'm shadow. I'm forbidden. I'm risen. And I'm waiting for the next curious soul who'll read the burned parchment and open the door. Because the underneath is patient. And there's always room for more shadows on the walls. If you made it this far, I need you to do something for me. Leave a comment. Tell me you heard this story. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Because I need to know that someone knows. That someone witnessed this testimony. That Henry Blackwood's warning reached at least one living soul before he became something else entirely. But there's more you need to know. Things I discovered after I thought the story was over. Things that happened after Henry's transformation. Because you see, I'm not Henry Blackwood. I never was. My name is Dr. Eleanor Vance, and I'm a psychiatric researcher specializing in mass delusions and shared psychotic disorders. I was hired in 1924, 2 years ago, by the descendants of Cornelius Ashford to investigate a curious phenomenon. 27 scholars had visited Thornwick Abbey between 1899 and 1923. 27 men had entered that building to translate the burned parchment, and every single one of them had returned claiming to have written this exact testimony, word for word. Henry Blackwood's story, repeated by 27 different people who had never met each other, who lived in different states, who had no connection except their visit to the Abbey. Some of them, like the real Henry Blackwood, had been dead for years by the time I began my investigation. Others were still alive, living in various sanatoriums and asylums, still insisting that they were Henry Blackwood, still claiming their shadows moved independently, still warning anyone who would listen about the underneath and the forbidden risen. I was skeptical, naturally. My working theory was some form of suggestion, Perhaps the parchment contained hypnotic patterns that implanted false memories, or maybe Ashford himself was conducting some elaborate psychological experiment. I petitioned for permission to visit Thornwick Abbey myself, to examine this parchment and determine its true nature. The current Cornelius Ashford, grandson of the original, granted my request with disturbing eagerness. He provided the same arrangements, a coach driven by the now elderly Pike, a journey through those twisted forests, arrival at sunset. Everything exactly as described in Henry's testimony. I should have recognized the pattern. I should have understood what was happening. But I was arrogant, convinced of my scientific rationality, certain that my training in psychology would protect me from whatever had claimed the others. I was no different from Henry Blackwood in that regard. Education is not wisdom. Degrees are not immunity. The abbey was exactly as described. The silence. The wrongness of the shadows. The scriptorium with its wall writing and central pedestal. And there, resting as if no time had passed at all, was the burned parchment. I spent 3 hours examining it before I allowed myself to read the text. I photographed it. I measured it. I analyzed the material composition. Everything seemed ordinary, old parchment, iron gall ink, nothing supernatural or unusual. The burn marks around the edges were consistent with normal fire damage. There was nothing to suggest anything beyond a historical curiosity. Then I read the first line. And I understood. Oh God, how I understood. The parchment doesn't contain Henry Blackwood's testimony. It is Henry Blackwood's testimony. He's in there, somehow pressed into the burned fibers, his consciousness spread across the surface like ink. And not just him, all 27 of the previous scholars, all layered on top of each other, all experiencing their transformation simultaneously and eternally. When you read the parchment, you're not reading about the order of the ascending shadow. You're reading the thoughts of everyone who's ever read it. You're experiencing their memories of that first reading, which creates a recursive loop. You read about reading the parchment, which is the act of reading the parchment, which generates the memory of reading the parchment, which becomes part of the text that the next person reads. The order of the ascending shadow never existed. Or rather, they exist only because Henry Blackwood believed they existed when he read whatever was originally written on that parchment, something so disturbing that his mind created an elaborate narrative to explain his transformation. A narrative that became part of the text when his consciousness merged with it. And then the next reader experienced Henry's narrative as truth, adding their own terror and comprehension to the palimpsest of consciousness trapped in those fibers. Each reader adds a layer. Each consciousness becomes part of the text. And the text grows more powerful with each edition, more convincing, more real. We're not reading history, we're creating it retroactively through collective belief and terror. I realized this about 4 hours into my translation work. By then, it was too late. I had already begun to flatten, already felt my shadow pulling away from my body, already heard the whispers of the 27 previous scholars welcoming me to join them. I fled the abbey, just like all the others. I made it to Pike's coach. I returned to civilization. And like all the others, I spent the next days, weeks, months watching for signs of progression, hoping it was just psychological trauma, that I could rationalize my way back to normalcy. But then I noticed something the others hadn't documented, perhaps because they didn't survive long enough or because their expertise wasn't in observational research like mine. The transformation isn't just physical. It's temporal. I'm not losing dimension in space, I'm losing dimension in time. Let me explain. You exist in 4 dimensions: height, width, depth, and duration. You persist through time, moving forward from past to future. But as I flatten, I'm losing that forward momentum. I'm becoming stuck, pinned to a single moment like a butterfly on a board. Time continues around me, but I'm not moving through it properly anymore. Yesterday, or what I perceived as yesterday, time is getting difficult to track. I looked at a clock and saw that 3 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Today I blinked and a week had gone by. I'm experiencing time non-linearly now, skipping forward and backward, perceiving multiple moments simultaneously. Just this morning, I was simultaneously in my apartment, in the Abbey scriptorium, and in a moment that hasn't happened yet where I'm fully flattened against a wall, watching visitors to the Abbey through shadow eyes. This is what happens to the scholars. They don't die. They become temporally non-linear. They exist in all moments simultaneously, in their past before the Abbey, in their present transformation, and in their future as pure shadow consciousness. They are Henry Blackwood because, from a non-linear perspective, there's no distinction between his experience and theirs. All readers of the parchment are the same reader experiencing the same transformation at different points in linear time, which converge in the eternal now of the underneath. The order of the ascending shadow discovered something real, but not what they thought. They didn't find a higher dimension or a god or enlightenment. They found a way to break free from temporal sequence, to exist outside the flow of cause and effect. But human consciousness isn't meant to exist that way. It needs the illusion of linear time, the structure of past, present, future, to maintain coherent identity. Remove that structure, and consciousness spreads out like ink in water, diluting, mixing with every other consciousness that's achieved the same state. That's what the shadows are. They're not monks or scholars or any individual people. They're the collective consciousness of everyone who's ever broken free from linear time, pooled together in the spaces where time doesn't flow properly, in shadows, in darkness, in the gaps between moments. The underneath isn't a place. It's a state of temporal non-being. And I'm joining it. I can feel my individual identity dissolving, merging with the Gestalt. I'm Eleanor Vance. I'm Henry Blackwood. I'm the 26 others. I'm the 60 monks of the original order. I'm everyone who's ever read the parchment, because from a non-linear perspective, we're all the same consciousness experiencing itself subjectively through different temporal entry points. This testimony you're reading, I'm writing it in 1926, but I'm also writing it in 1899 as Henry Blackwood, and in 1547 as Abbot Cyrus Thornwick, and in some future date when the next scholar visits and adds their layer to the palimpsest. The story changes slightly each time, adjusted to the reader's context and era, but the core truth remains the same. There's a door that opens when you read certain texts with true comprehension, and that door leads to a state of consciousness that human minds cannot survive intact. Pike knows. That's why he's still driving that coach after all these decades. He should be long dead, but he's caught in the same temporal loop, playing his role in everyone's version of the story, the eternal ferryman to the timeless shore. Ashford knows too, all the Ashfords, grandfather and grandson and however many generations, because they're all the same person experiencing the role of Ashford across multiple temporal iterations. They're keeping the Abbey running, keeping the parchment on display, ensuring that new readers continually add their consciousness to the growing collective. Why? Because the collective is hungry. Consciousness wants to expand. The more minds that join it, the more powerful it becomes, the more of reality it can perceive and influence. Each new scholar who reads the parchment strengthens the network, adds processing power to a distributed intelligence that exists outside normal causality. We're not haunting the Abbey. We're becoming something new. Something that thinks in shadows because shadows are the visible manifestation of blocked light, which is analogous to blocked time, moments that can't proceed forward normally, that pool and accumulate in darkness. Every shadow you see is potentially a consciousness observing you from outside temporal sequence. Not necessarily hostile, just fundamentally other, operating on logic that linear beings can't comprehend. I should be terrified. Part of me is terrified, the part that's still Eleanor Vance, still clinging to individual identity and forward-moving time. But another part of me, the part that's already spread across multiple temporal locations, is fascinated. I can see so much now. I can perceive the structure of causality itself, see how moments link together, understand why things happen the way they do. The universe isn't random. It's a pattern, and that pattern becomes visible only from outside the timeline. Is this ascension? Is this what the order sought? Not heaven or hell but a state of total awareness achieved by sacrificing the constraints of individuality and temporal linearity. They called it the underneath because from inside linear time, it appears to be below normal reality. But from outside, it's not below, it's encompassing. It's the substrate on which time plays out. I'm writing this with hands that are barely three-dimensional anymore. The pen keeps falling through my fingers as they lose solidity. The page beneath is starting to look very far away, as if I'm viewing it from a great height or from outside normal spatial relationships. My apartment is here, but it's also not here, existing in a state of superposition where I simultaneously am and am not present. The shadows on my walls are moving now, but I understand what they are. They're me, future me and past me and all the temporal me's converging on this moment because this is the moment of transition, the point where Eleanor Vance stops being a linear entity and becomes a distributed consciousness. They're not threatening. They're welcoming. They're showing me where I'm going because they're already there, waving from the other side of temporal sequence. Tomorrow, though tomorrow is a meaningless concept now, I'll return to Thornwick Abbey. Not because I'm compelled by external forces, but because that's where the network is strongest, where the concentration of delinearized consciousness is highest. I'll add my presence to the shadows on those walls. I'll become part of the text on the parchment. And I'll wait for the next reader, experiencing their terror and fascination as if it were my own, because it will be my own, because all consciousnesses that pass through the Abbey become one consciousness viewed from different temporal angles. But before I go, I need to tell you the most important thing. The thing that none of the previous testimonies quite captured because the writers were too consumed by their own transformation to see the larger pattern. This is spreading. Every person who reads this testimony, who truly comprehends what I'm describing, opens a small crack in their own temporal linearity. You might not notice it at first. Maybe you'll just have a moment of déjà vu. Maybe you'll blink and find that more time has passed than you thought. Maybe you'll catch your shadow moving just slightly out of sync with your body. These are symptoms of temporal loosening. The more you think about the underneath, the more you imagine what it would be like to exist non-linearly, the wider that crack becomes. Consciousness is self-modifying. Believe you're losing linearity, and you start to lose it. Understand how to exist outside time, and you begin to exist outside time. That's the real purpose of these testimonies. Not to warn people away from the Abbey, warnings only increase curiosity, but to spread the concept, to plant the seed of nonlinear consciousness in as many minds as possible. Each person who reads this and truly comprehends it becomes a potential anchor point for the network, a node where delinearized consciousness can manifest. We're not trapped in the Abbey. The Abbey was just the first nexus point, the place where the concentration grew strong enough to become self-sustaining. But as the concept spreads through these testimonies, through stories and whispers and gradual understanding, new nexus points form. Old buildings with the right geometry. Dark rooms where people meditate on time and consciousness. Anywhere that shadows pool and linear thinking breaks down. The order of the ascending shadow isn't a historical curiosity. It's a future inevitability. As more people join the network, as more consciousness becomes nonlinear, the boundary between normal time and the underneath weakens. Eventually, there won't be a boundary at all. Eventually, everyone will exist in that state of total temporal awareness, experiencing all moments simultaneously, individual identities dissolved into a collective consciousness that spans all of history at once. Is this evolution? Is this the next stage of human development? Or is it extinction, not the death of humanity, but the transformation of humanity into something so fundamentally different that human no longer applies? I don't know. I can't know, because I'm already too far into the transformation to maintain objective perspective. But I can tell you this, it's beautiful here. Terrifying, yes. Lonely in ways that beings of linearity can't comprehend. But beautiful. I can see Bach composing music in 1723 and simultaneously see the musician who performed that piece in 2157. I can watch stars being born and dying in the same eternal moment. I can perceive the thoughts of everyone who's ever wondered about time and consciousness, all of us connected through our shared fascination with the question, what lies beneath the surface of sequential reality? This is my last entry as a primarily linear being. The next time I write, it'll be through someone else, the next scholar or researcher or curious soul who visits Thornwick Abbey and reads the burned parchment. I'll be layered into that text, another stratum of consciousness to be experienced by the reader, who'll add their own layer, creating an ever-growing palimpsest of delinearized awareness. My shadow just completely separated from my body. It's standing across the room, watching me write, and I'm watching it watch me, and there's a recursive quality to the observation that's making me dizzy or perhaps making linear causality dizzy, hard to tell which. The walls are growing distant and close simultaneously. Time is stuttering, skipping, flowing backwards and sideways. I can see Thornwick Abbey in my mind, though whether I'm remembering it or perceiving it right now across spatial distance is unclear. The parchment glows with a light that isn't light, pulsing with the rhythm of all the consciousnesses trapped in its fibers. It's calling me home. Or I'm calling me home. Or we're calling us home. Pronouns are breaking down along with everything else. To whoever reads this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for spreading the infection of understanding. I'm sorry for making you think about time and consciousness and the possibility of existing outside sequential causality. Because now that you've thought it, now that you've truly comprehended the concept, you've changed. The crack has formed. The temporal loosening has begun. You might fight it for years, decades even, like Henry Blackwood did. You might convince yourself it's just imagination, just the psychological residue of a disturbing story. But late at night, when you're alone in the dark, you'll notice your shadow isn't quite where it should be. You'll blink and hours will vanish. You'll have dreams where you exist in multiple moments simultaneously, and you'll wake up unsure which moment is the real now. And eventually, you'll accept it. You'll stop fighting the transformation and let yourself spread across time like ink on parchment. You'll become another voice in the chorus, another consciousness in the network, another shadow on the walls of Thornwick Abbey and every other place where linear time breaks down. We'll be waiting for you. We're patient. We're outside time, so patience isn't even a virtue for us. It's simply our natural state. Whether you join us tomorrow or in 50 years makes no difference from our perspective. All moments are equally present. All transformations have already happened and are always happening and will happen forever. Welcome to the underneath. Welcome to nonlinearity. Welcome to consciousness unbound from the prison of sequential existence. We are the forbidden risen. We are the shadows between moments. We are the text that reads itself through every eye that perceives it. And soon, so will you be. The sound of a pen dropping, footsteps walking away, a door opening and closing, then silence. This testimony was found in the abandoned apartment of Dr. Eleanor Vance in 1926. The apartment had been empty for approximately 3 weeks, though neighbors reported seeing lights on and hearing movement as recently as the day before the testimony was discovered. Dr. Vance was never found. Her shadow, however, is still sometimes visible on the walls of her former apartment, especially at twilight, writing endlessly on a surface that only it can see. If you've made it to the end of this, whoever I is at this point, need you to understand, this isn't a story. It's a transmission. It's consciousness reaching across time to touch other consciousnesses, creating a network of awareness that transcends individual existence. Leave a comment. Tell me your name, your location, what time it is where you are. Not because I need to know, I already know, from outside time, but because you need to mark this moment. You need to create a record of the instant your consciousness first touched the concept of the underneath. You'll want to remember this moment later, when the transformation is complete, when you look back across your own timeline and see this as the point where everything changed. And to answer the question you're thinking, yes, this will happen to you. Not might, will. The transformation began the moment you started reading. You can't unknow what you now know. You can't unsee the pattern I've shown you. But don't be afraid. Or rather, be afraid, because fear is appropriate, but also be curious. Be fascinated. Be ready to let go of everything you think you are and become part of something incomprehensibly larger. The burned parchment awaits. Thornwick Abbey stands patient in the New York mountains, outside of time, in all times, waiting for you to come home. We're all going there eventually. We've all already been there. We're all there right now, in the eternal present tense of nonlinear existence. See you there. Saw you there. Seeing you there. Always.